Okay, so here we have chapter 20, A Time of Social Change. And this chapter really is going to look at the major social transitions and changes that were taking place in the United States between, let's say, 1960 and probably 1975 for the most part. Most of what we're looking at kind of started in the 60s and carried into the 1970s, and that includes many different groups pushing for greater rights, including women, Native Americans, and Latinos. Includes the counterculture movement, also known as the hippies. It also includes a little bit of student activism that took place, a consumer, it's the right word, consumer concerns, the beginning of kind of having consumer protections or consumer advocacy, and also the development of the environmentalist movement began during this time frame as well. So we start in section 1 looking at women and Native Americans fighting for change. The main idea for this section is that in the 1960s, women and Native Americans struggled to achieve social justice. And so our learning objectives for this first section, by the end of this section, you should be able to explain what led to the revival of the women's movement, list the issues that were important to the women's liberation movement, describe what the lives of Native Americans were like by the early 1960s, and explain how Native Americans fought for fairness. So we start our look with the women's liberation movement. The movement for women's rights had many different names: the women's liberation movement, the feminist movement, and the equal rights movement. The core belief of the women's liberation movement was feminism, the conviction that women and men should be socially, politically, and economically equal. Feminists cheered the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in employment. Still, fighting gender-based discrimination was given a low priority. This brings us to the feminine mystique. In 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique stirred up women all across the country. Friedan found that many women had everything that they could want, but still felt unfulfilled. Continuing our look at the women's liberation movement, with the formation of NOW, the National Organization for Women. They fought gender discrimination in the workplace, schools, and justice system. They lobbied government, filed lawsuits, staged rallies and marches, and it was led by Betty Friedan and Pauli Murray. The ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, promised equal treatment for men and women in all spheres, not just in employment. Some saw the ERA as a threat to family life. Phyllis Schlafly and other conservatives campaigned to defeat the ERA. And then we had the infamous Roe v. Wade decision, where the Supreme Court, in this case, struck down state laws that banned abortion. They argued that such laws violated a constitutional right to privacy, and it sparked a debate that continues to this day, as we still continue to see the country pretty much split down the middle between those that are pro-life or opposed to abortion, and those that are pro-choice, or those that feel an abortion is a matter of a woman's right to choose what she does with her body. Now looking at some of the successes and failures of the civil rights movement, of the women's liberation movement. The women's movement experienced many successes and failures as it fought for women's rights. In 1972, Congress passed the Educational Amendments. One of the sections, Title IX, prohibited federally funded schools from discriminating on the basis of gender in all areas, including academics and athletics. Title IX has become controversial because instead of increasing athletic opportunities for women, some colleges have used it as an excuse to cut opportunities for men. Now looking at the effects of the women's movement, the number of women holding professional jobs increased. More women moved into senior positions in the government. More female politicians were elected to Congress. The feminist movement slowed its pace in the late 1970s, as there was a perception that it only benefited wealthy white women. Now we begin our look at Native Americans in the early 1960s. Living conditions. They did not share in the prosperity of the 1950s. So while the 1950s was a very prosperous time in the United States, there were groups that were left out, and Native Americans as a group were left out of that prosperity. They had the highest unemployment rates in the nation, and the average income was less than half that of white American men. They also suffered disproportionately from poor health. The termination policy. This was a plan to draw Native Americans out of the isolated reservations and into mainstream society. The method used was to stop federal services to reservations and to relocate Native Americans to cities. The policy was a disaster. A movement. In 1961, a group of 700 Native Americans held a conference to oppose the termination policy. And they drafted the Declaration of Indian Purpose, and this marked the beginning of the Red Power movement. Native Americans fight for fairness. President Johnson established the National Council on Indian Opportunity to get Native Americans more involved in setting policy regarding Indian affairs. Real change, however, came from the efforts of Native American political activists. During the period of Red Power activism, Native Americans made important legislative gains. Congress passed laws that enhanced education, health care, voting rights, and religious freedom for Native Americans. The occupation of Alcatraz. A group of Native Americans tried to reclaim Alcatraz Island. They claimed that the Treaty of Fort Laramie gave them the right to use any surplus federal territory. The occupation lasted for 18 months until federal marshals removed the group by force. This incident drew public attention to the plight of Native Americans. Partly as a result, New Mexico returned 48,000 acres of land to the Taos Pueblo in 1970. AIM. The American Indian Movement was founded in Minnesota in 1968. It became the major force behind the Red Power movement. It called for a renewal of traditional cultures, economic independence, and better education for Indian children. Russell Means was one of AIM's best-known leaders. AIM sometimes used forceful tactics, such as the Trail of Broken Treaties and the occupation of Wounded Knee. Which pictured here, we see armed Native Americans standing guard during the occupation of Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Other organizations in the fight for fairness. The National Indian Education Association fought to improve access to education. The Native American Rights Fund provided legal services. The Council on Energy Resources Tribes helped its member nations gain control over their natural resources and choose whether to protect or develop them. These groups and others work to protect Native Americans' rights, improve standards of living, and to do it all in a manner consistent with Native American cultures and traditions. Assessing the progress of the fight for fairness. Congress passed a number of laws in the 1970s to enhance education, health care, voting rights, and religious freedom for Native Americans. The Red Power movement instilled greater pride in Native Americans and generated wider appreciation of Native American culture. Despite these accomplishments, Native Americans continued to face many problems. Unemployment remained high, and the high school dropout rate among Native Americans was the highest in the nation. Now we move into section 2, Latinos fight for rights. The main idea of this section is that in the 1960s, Latinos struggled to achieve social justice. Our learning objectives for this section are to describe what the lives of Latinos were like in the early 1960s, to describe the event that launched the Latino struggle for social justice, and to list the main goals of the movements for Latino rights. Now, looking at Latinos in the early 1960s, more than 900,000 Latinos lived in the United States in 1960. A Latino is any person of Latin American descent, so that would include basically all of the nations in the Americas, from Mexico moving south, all the way through Central America and South America. 1/3 of Mexican American families live below the poverty line, and twice as many Mexican Americans as white Americans were unemployed. Latinos faced discrimination in education. For example, the schools had less qualified teachers, fewer resources, and shabbier facilities. Also, few teachers were able to speak Spanish. In politics, Latinos had far less power than the size of their population warranted. Electoral district boundaries kept Latino votes scattered. The number of Latinos in political office was very small, and Latinos were often excluded from serving on juries. Now, looking at Latinos' struggle for social justice. What is social justice? Well, Latinos sought social justice, which is the fair distribution of the advantages and disadvantages in society. And then we look at the Delano grape strike. Migrant workers, many of whom were Latino, received low wages for backbreaking work. In 1965, Filipino farm workers went on strike in Delano, California. The National Farm Workers Association soon joined them. Cesar Chavez. He co-founded the National Farm Workers Association, a union of Mexican American farm workers. His leadership inspired many Mexican Americans to fight discrimination in their lives. So this brings us to the Delano grape strike, taking a closer look. In 1965, Filipino farm workers went on strike and demanded a 15-cent increase in their hourly wage. Now, 15 cents may not sound like much now, but 15 cents was a lot more money, would have been a lot more significant raise back in 1965. Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez agreed to help. Some 5,000 grape workers walked off their jobs. The Delano grape strike lasted for 5 years. Strikers picketed the fields. Chavez led a 250-mile march to the state capitol. Huerta sent union activists around the nation to set up local boycott committees. Union activists and sympathetic volunteers stood in front of grocery stores nationwide, urging Americans not to buy grapes. The growers finally gave in and finally settled with the union. The success of the strike made Cesar Chavez a national figure. The movement for Latino rights continued. The Chicano movement. Chicano is a shortened form of Mexicanos. They wanted to convey ethnic pride and commitment to political activism. Reyes Lopez Tiarina was an early Chicano leader who formed Alianza Federal de Mercedes, or Federal Alliance of Land Grants. Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez was another leading figure in the Chicano movement. He founded the Crusade for Justice. A group of college students in Texas formed the Mexican American Youth Organization, or MAYO. Jose Angel Gutierrez founded La Raza Unida Party. Working-class Chicano students in Los Angeles formed the Brown Berets, one of the most militant organizations in the Chicano movement. Alianza. Reyes Lopez Tiarina focused on the enduring issues of land rights. Despite the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexican Americans had lost thousands of acres over the years. The Crusade for Justice. Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez promoted Mexican American nationalism, provided legal aid, a theater for cultural awareness, a Spanish newspaper, and other community services, and sponsored the National Chicano Liberation Youth Conference. Mayo. Jose Angel Gutierrez was the leader. They wanted to achieve economic independence for Mexican Americans, gain local control over the education of Hispanic children, and a third political party. They organized school walkouts and mass demonstrations centered in Crystal City, Texas. La Raza Unida. Gutierrez formed RUP, the United People Party, political party, which campaigned for bilingual education, improved public services, education for children of migrant workers, and an end to job discrimination. RUP candidates were elected to several offices in Texas cities. The RUP expanded into Colorado and other parts of the Southwest. Disagreements, though, among RUP leaders caused the party to fall apart in the late 1970s. The Brown Berets, one of the most militant organizations in the Chicano movement, began by protesting against police brutality in East Los Angeles. They fought for bilingual education, better school conditions, Chicano studies, and more Chicano teachers. They supported efforts of Chicanos to regain their historic lands, the National Farm Workers campaigns, and protested the high number of Chicano deaths in Vietnam. They disbanded in 1972. The Boricua movement. Boricua is the name by which many Puerto Ricans refer to themselves, and this expresses ethnic pride and support for political activism. Many Puerto Ricans migrated to the United States after World War II. Immigrants experienced social and economic discrimination. The movement's goals shifted from self-government for Puerto Rico and better conditions for all Puerto Ricans. The Young Lords was a militant Boricua organization, and Taller Boricua was a community arts organization. Cuban Americans. Many well-to-do Cubans fled Castro's communist government for the United States. The majority of immigrants were professionals and business people. Most Cuban Americans who organized for a change were seeking changes for Cuba, such as the overthrow of Castro and communism. And this brings us to the culture and counterculture. So the main idea here is that the counterculture that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s left a lasting impact on American life. Our learning objectives for this section are to explain the rise of the counterculture, to describe life in the counterculture, list the mainstream American society's reactions to the counterculture, and describe the legacy that the counterculture left behind. Okay, the rise of the counterculture. The counterculture of the 1960s was a rebellion of teens and young adults against mainstream American society. Young Americans believed that society's values were too hollow and that its priorities were misplaced. They called the mainstream the establishment. They wanted to create an alternative culture based on peace and love. So where did the counterculture come from? Well, the number of teens and young adults in the United States rose dramatically in the 1960s. And of course, this was really due to the baby boom generation, those people born, starting in 1945, right at the end of World War II, when we had this large, rapid increase in the birth rate. During the 1960s, these first of the baby boomers were first starting to get into their teens and early 20s during the 1960s. These young people were living in turbulent times. They had had to deal with the threat of nuclear war, racial discriminations and segregation, the Vietnam War, and environmental pollution. Rebellion against the dominant culture was not new. The Beat generation of the 1950s questioned traditional values, challenged authority, and experimented with nonconformist styles. Now, looking at rising student activism, students on college campuses began rebelling against school policies that they considered restrictive, unjust, or just not relevant. At the University of California at Berkeley, students protested when school officials banned speech-making and political organizing at the entrances of the campus. The events at Berkeley marked the beginning of the free speech movement, which swept campuses across the nation. The students used the tactics of civil disobedience to protest injustices. Mainstream Americans were shocked, as they expected young people not to question authority. So there had been kind of what had traditionally been accepted is that young people listened to authority figures. But this is really the first group that really began to en masse challenge the authority. And once again, that was shocking because it was a cultural shift from what had traditionally been accepted. Now, looking at life in the counterculture. Okay, the counterculture. Thousands of teens and young adults left school, jobs, and traditional home life. They rejected materialism and the work ethic of the older generation. The center of this was in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, which Haight and Ashbury is an intersection of two streets, Haight and Ashbury, but in that immediate neighborhood right around that intersection is the area known as the Haight-Ashbury district, and this became the center of the counterculture. Now, looking at hippie culture, they sought new experiences. Eastern religions, astrology, the occult, and illegal drugs were all common as a part of the hippie culture. Casual and colorful clothes were common. Men began wearing longer hair, beards, or afros. And they also kind of became known as flower children. Now, looking at the decline. The height of the hippie movement was the summer of 1967, which was also known as the Summer of Love. Freedoms often led to problems with addiction. Many in the counterculture became addicted to drugs. There were problems with overdoses. And then also, they had no means of supporting themselves. And the lack of rules led to conflicts. And here you can see a photo of the Haight-Ashbury intersection. So this was the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, which was the center of the counterculture of the late 1960s. Spirituality. As counterculture members rejected materialism, many embraced spirituality, including a broad range of beliefs: astrology, magic, Eastern religions, and new forms of Christianity. Two new religious groups at this time were the Unification Church and the Hare Krishna movement, pictured here. Now we look at mainstream reactions to the counterculture. Some observers of the counterculture were put off by the unkempt appearance of the hippies. On a deeper level, many mainstream Americans objected to the unconventional values of the counterculture. They saw hippies as disrespectful, uncivilized, and threatening. To many in the establishment, it appeared that society was unraveling. The television show All in the Family, which we'll look at in another chapter on the 1970s, highlighted the older generation's distrust of the counterculture and the younger generation's desire to change society. The main character in All in the Family was Archie Bunker, who was very conservative. And his daughter and son-in-law on this sitcom were hippies. And so many of the storylines dealt with this tension between the two. The end of the counterculture. The counterculture declined in part due to illicit drug use. Some became addicted to drugs and others died from drug overdoses. Some hippie communities became involved with criminal activities, the most notorious of which was Charlie Manson and his followers who were responsible for the Tate LaBianca murders. And here we'll watch a clip on the Tate LaBianca murders.
5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of...
It's one of the most gruesome crimes in American history.
So much hate, so much blood.
The murders of 7 in Los Angeles, including a beautiful actress and a wealthy heiress.
There was this feeling all over LA that things had really gone bad suddenly.
Charles Manson was the force behind the killings, but it was his mistresses who had blood on their hands.
I felt absolutely nothing for her as she begged for her life and for the life of her baby.
By midsummer, Manson begins evangelizing about an apocalyptic race war, which will be led by black Americans. He supports his dark vision with an interpretation of the Beatles song called Helter Skelter.
Manson thought that the Beatles were prophets and that they were speaking to him and other tuned-in people beneath the lyrics of their songs. So he told the members of his family the Beatles want a violent revolution.
That's what he said, that next summer there would be this big revolution and that the chosen people would live in a hole in the middle of the desert.
Manson tells the women and other family members that they are the chosen people. He says it is up to them to start a civil war by committing high-profile murders that will be blamed on black America. By early August, Charles Manson is ready to ignite the revolution. Saturday, August 9th, 1969. Patricia Krenwinkel and Susan Atkins are summoned by Manson. He tells them Helter Skelter is at hand. 20 miles away, in a house in Benedict Canyon, actress Sharon Tate is spending the evening with friends. Roman Polanski, the father of her unborn child, is in Europe shooting a film. Back at Spahn Ranch, Manson names Linda Kasabian designated driver and tells family member Tex Watson to lead the 3 women to 10050 Cielo Drive.
And we drove to the house with instructions to kill everyone in the house.
It's a house where Manson and Watson once visited producer Terry Melcher and his girlfriend Candice Bergen. Melcher doesn't live there anymore, but Manson doesn't know and doesn't care. The house is chosen because Watson knows the layout. It is close to 10 p.m. on a near moonless night when the killers reach the estate in Benedict Canyon. Tex Watson climbs a telephone pole in front of the house and cuts the wires. Then Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel scale a wall in front of the house and enter the property. At approximately 11:15, 18-year-old Stephen Parent is leaving the estate after visiting William Garretson, a groundskeeper who lives in a guest house on the property. Garretson will be the only one left alive by evening's end. Parent isn't as lucky. Tex Watson approaches his car and executes him with 4 shots. Moments later, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Watson enter the house. There, they encounter coffee heiress Abigail Folger, her lover Wojtek Frykowski, hairstylist Jay Sebring, and actress Sharon Tate.
I remember when we first went in, one of the people said, "Who are you?" and Tex said, "I'm the devil and I'm here to do the devil's business."
The first person to die inside the house is Jay Sebring. When he refuses to obey Tex Watson's orders, he is shot, beaten, and stabbed.
All I can remember seeing is people just scattering in different places and running in different places.
Patricia Krenwinkel chases Abigail Folger onto the front lawn, and she stabs her over 20 times. Folger refuses to die. Watson finishes her off, plunging a knife into her stomach. Then, Susan Atkins targets Wojtek Frykowski.
I had tied his hands with a towel and then was instructed to kill him. And he and I began to fight. And I remember I was screaming for help and he was screaming for help. And then Tex came and helped me.
Frykowski is stabbed 51 times. He is then shot twice. Finally, he is beaten to death with the gun. Now, only Sharon Tate remains alive.
I felt nothing. I felt absolutely nothing for her as she begged for her life and for the life of the baby.
Tate's pleas go unheeded. Watson and Atkins stab her to death. Then, Atkins takes a towel, dips it in Tate's blood, and writes "pig" on the front door.
It's so alive in me, even just recalling it. I remember that I had gone so far and there was no turning back.
Their bloody mission complete, the women and Tex drive back to the ranch with Linda Kasabian. The following day, Roman Polanski learns what Los Angeles already knows, that his wife and her friends have been found viciously beaten, stabbed, and shot to death.
All of you know how beautiful she was. But only few of you know how good she was.
When word of the horrendous crimes hits the newsstands, fear spreads through the city, especially among the wealthy.
Esquire magazine said it very, very well. They said in the great homes of Bel Air, terror sends people flying to their telephones when a branch falls from a tree outside.
But this time, Los Angeles has good reason to fear. Coming up, in 24 hours, terror strikes again.
Tonight in Los Angeles, a movie actress and 4 of her friends were murdered. The circumstances were lurid. The movie actress is Sharon Tate, 26.
August 10th, 1969. Less than 24 hours after the brutal murders of Sharon Tate and 4 others, Charles Manson orders another killing. This time, Leslie Van Houten is selected to accompany Patricia Krenwinkel, Tex Watson, and Manson himself.
We drove all over L.A., and Manson was very agitated, and Kasabian was very nervous and upset, and he was yelling at her a lot.
The group drives to the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles and picks out a house on Waverly Drive. The owners are Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary. Charles Manson leaves the car and enters the house.
So Manson came back, he looked in the car, and he pointed at Pat and I and told us to get out and go do what Tex said.
Manson then leaves the scene with Linda Kasabian. Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, and Tex Watson enter the house and discover the LaBiancas tied up.
They were very frightened, and Pat and I went in the kitchen. I think Tex said to get knives, or anyway, we ended up in the kitchen getting knives. And Pat and I took Mrs. LaBianca into the bedroom. Pat went to stab her and the knife bent, and she was yelling out for her husband.
The women and Watson stabbed the LaBiancas a total of 53 times. Patricia Krenwinkel then adds a famously macabre touch to the crime scene.
She carved the word war on Lino LaBianca's stomach and plunged a fork in his stomach also. She wrote the word helter-skelter in blood on the refrigerator door at the LaBianca residence.
The crime scene is among the bloodiest the LAPD has ever seen, and they begin a massive manhunt to track down the killers. 3 months later, all of the members of the Manson family are arrested, but not for the murders. Police want them for auto theft. But when family member Susan Atkins lands in jail, she begins to tell her cellmates about Manson. It's the lucky break the LAPD needs.
She told 2 co-inmates of hers that she was a member of a family, and the family was responsible for all these murders, the Tate LaBianca murders, that the police were still trying to solve.
Susan Atkins' unwitting jailhouse confession leads to the arrests of Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Linda Kasabian, Tex Watson, and Charles Manson. On December 1st, 1969, they are all charged with murder. Los Angeles District Attorney Vincent Bugliosi is assigned to prosecute the case.
Well, you have to
The name Charles Manson will always be associated with mass murder, but the names of Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, Susan Atkins, and Squeaky Fromm will also be remembered. They were teenage girls looking for the same thing when they met Charles Manson: love, comfort, attention. Instead, they found themselves with blood on their hands, which can never be washed away.
It's hard to imagine that Manson once had aspirations as a singer-songwriter in Hollywood, even going so far as to record some of his music.
Look at your game, girl.
But that music may have indirectly led to the mayhem which followed. Vincent Bugliosi was the man who prosecuted Manson and his family members. In his best-selling work on the events of 1969, Bugliosi theorized that Manson's anger came as a result of the rejection of his music by Doris Day's son, record producer Terry Melcher. Melcher once lived at the house where Tate and the others were murdered. It's a theory Manson rejects.
Terry Melcher came to me. I didn't come to Terry Melcher. He come to me with money in his hand. He offered me. I didn't ask him. I wasn't knocking someone's door down. I was running from that. When I got out, I was in that. I was already through that. I had that. I had the studio. I went to the studio. Went to Vox Studios. I had it all. And I looked at it and I said, this is a bigger jail than I just got out of. I don't want to take my time going to work. I got a motorcycle and a sleeping bag and 10 or 15 girls. What the hell I want to go off and go to work for? Work for what? Money? I got all the money in the world. I'm the king, man. I run the underworld, guy. I decide who does what and where they do it at. When am I going to run around and act like I'm some teeny bopper somewhere for somebody else's money? I make the money, man. I roll the nickels. The game is mine. I deal the cards.
Sad, sad game.
So it's about it. How you want? How do you your heart? Yeah, that's what I sing. I sing, just however I feel.
But Manson's biggest legacy was not his music. It was the fear which gripped Hollywood following the killings.
Was it an intention of yours to scare the Hollywood community?
Hollywood's been afraid since it began. Hollywood knows Hollywood. Anybody that knows the garbage cans in the alley understands Hollywood.
Look out, Elvis careful.
Finally, after 2 decades, Charles Manson remains an enigma. Outlaw, cult leader, convicted murderer. He is the man who most terrorized Hollywood.
People look at you today, 20 years later, and they still have no idea what you're about. Tell me in a sentence who you are.
Nobody. I'm nobody. I'm a tramp, a bum, a hobo. I'm a boxcar and a jug of wine. And a straight razor if you get too close to me.
And so here we look at the legacy of the counterculture. Attitudes. Americans became more casual in the way they dressed and more open-minded about lifestyles and social behavior. The attitudes about sexual behavior loosened. People explored topics that were once taboo. As far as art and film, a new style called pop art emerged, which aimed to appeal to the popular tastes. Andy Warhol led the movement. Film broadened its subject matter as censorship rules relaxed, and the film industry adopted a rating system. As far as music, the Beatles brought new techniques and ideas to rock and roll. Bob Dylan wrote political songs and became the spokesperson for his generation. Woodstock and the art fair was the celebration of an era. And here's a picture of Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock, along with an audio clip of him playing the national anthem at Woodstock. Okay, now we look at environmentalism and the consumer movement. The main idea of this section is that the 1960s and 1970s saw the beginning of environmentalism and the consumer movement. Our learning objectives for this section. By the end of this section, you should be able to explain the goals of environmentalists in the 1960s and 70s and explain the arguments against environmentalism. So we start with Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was a marine biologist who wrote her book, Silent Spring, in which she warned that the increasing use of pesticides that killed insects were killing birds and fish as well. The environmental issues of the 1960s included logging in the Northwest, smog or air pollution from factories and cars in the cities, pollution and garbage in Lake Erie, and an oil spill off the California coast. We're now looking at the environmental movement. On April 22, 1970, the first Earth Day was held to focus on environmental problems in the United States. It led to the formation of groups like the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society. The EPA. In 1970, President Nixon signed the Environmental Protection Policy Act, which created the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. It took on the job of setting and enforcing pollution standards. The Clean Air Act of 1970 established emission standards for automobiles and factories. Critics claimed that environmental regulations are harmful to businesses and the economy. Environmental protection. The Clean Water Act of 1972 is the primary federal law regulating water pollution. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 was designed to protect critically imperiled species from extinction as a consequence of economic growth and development untempered by adequate concern and conservation. Love Canal. Love Canal is a neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York, where 21,000 tons of toxic waste had been buried beneath the neighborhood by a chemical company. Eventually, the government relocated more than 800 families and reimbursed them for their homes. Okay, here we go. 3 Mile Island. Nuclear energy was debated because supporters argued that it was cleaner than fossil fuels like coal and oil, but critics worried about the dangers of an accidental radiation release. On March 28, 1979, one of the reactors at the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility overheated, causing low levels of radiation to escape. The incident added to the fears of radiation, even though the plant was determined to be safe. And look at the consumerism, or the consumer movement. Consumers demanded safer products and accurate information about during the 1960s and 1970s. Ralph Nader became the leader of the consumer protection movement. Nader first criticized the automobile industry in an article that he wrote in 1959 called "The Safe Car That You Can't Buy." Traffic safety. Nader's efforts resulted in the passage of the National Traffic and Motor Safety Act in 1966. Nader became a leader in the push to protect the public from dangerous toys, flammable fabrics, and other hazardous consumer goods. And here's a clip of Ralph Nader speaking at Florida State University during the 1980s.
Most of what's going on in Washington is not government representing the people. It's government shoveling out billions of dollars in contracts or grants or subsidies or tax expenditures to business lobbyists and business claimants. If you look at the consumer regulatory part of Washington, It's a tiny part of the budget and a tiny part of the number of government employees, less than 1%. The big tickets are HEW and the Pentagon, and HEW, of course, in the educational and welfare, aid to dependent children and other areas. Even at its best, assuming it doesn't waste money, even at its best, it's just buying time. It's just taking serious problems in our society and trying to soothe them a little bit, fan them a little bit with the welfare and other grant disbursements. But it doesn't get at the root of the problem, which is that the fundamental institutions that built this country are being devastated. The families being seriously undermined, and not simply by what we like to call runaway fathers or poverty. Poverty is a symptom, it's not a cause. Why should there be any poverty in America? We have the greatest wealth, incredible natural resources, a terrific constitution. Why should there be any poverty in this country?
And here we have a look from National Geographic, A Moment in History. The Woodstock Nation. In August of 1969, more than 400,000 young people descended on a 600-acre farm in upstate New York for what was billed a 3 days of peace and music. Organizers of the Woodstock Music and Art Fair were overwhelmed by the turnout, massive traffic jams, supply shortages, inadequate first aid and sanitation facilities, and torrential rainfall did not dampen the joyous spirit of the crowd. People shared their food, blankets, bathed in the rain, and listened to an amazing collection of some of the greatest musicians of the 1960s. And here we have a look at some slides relating to the Chicano movement. During the 1960s and 1970s, Mexican Americans forged political power by embracing their cultural identity. Pictured here is Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta took an interest in social activism from a young age. In her early 20s, she was active in Mexican American self-help group called the Community Service Organization. It was there that she first met Cesar Chavez. Together they founded the National Farm Workers Association. In the late 1960s, she met feminist leader Gloria Steinem, whose influence led Huerta to incorporate feminist ideals into the Chicano movement. And over here we have a look at La Raza Unida. Jose Angel Gutierrez founded La Raza Unida to spur political change in Crystal City, Texas. The party moved to the state level in 1972, backing Ramsey Munoz for governor and supporting many Chicana candidates for other offices. Although Munoz did not win his race, La Raza Unida successfully changed the landscape of Texas politics. Continue our look by looking at Corky Gonzalez. Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez, a boxer turned activist, knew firsthand the plight of many poor Mexican Americans. Born to migrant farm workers, Gonzalez urged Mexican Americans to embrace their cultural heritage. He saw Chicano nationalism as a way for his people to gain economic independence and political power. And then student activism. In 1969, some 700 Mexican American high school students in Crystal City, Texas, boycotted class. The strike began as protest of the mainly Anglo cheerleading squad, but it grew to include broader education issues. The student action forced the school to abandon its discriminatory practices. And here's a look at Hispanic Americans, a statistical profile. According to the U.S. Census taken in 2000, more than half of all immigrants to the United States that year came from Latin America. Specifically, 1/4 of all immigrants that year came from Mexico. So here you can see the countries of origin: Mexico, Cuba, South America, and Central America. So here's 1960. In 1960, the country of origin, 73% were from Mexico, 10% were from Cuba, South America, 11%, and 6% were from other Central American nations. And when you move that over to the year 2000, that number for Mexican immigration has dropped to 64%, 5% now for Cuba. South American has increased to 16%, and Central America has increased to 15%. And then here's a look at Hispanics as a percentage of the total U.S. population. You can see that it has increased dramatically. So here we are in 1950, a little over 2%. You can see it steadily increasing, going over 4%, hit 6% in 1980. By 1990, it was up over about 8.5%, and has kept going. By the year 2000, it was over 12%, and continuing to go up. And here we have a political cartoon depicting the attitudes and lifestyles of the counterculture that shocked many Americans. As this cartoon depicts, some Americans believed hippies were defiant youths with no respect for authority. So in the cartoon, here you see kid speaking presumably to his old man. That's the trouble with you old fogey conservatives. I'll bet you still believe in the law of gravity. And then here you got his buddy in the background saying, tell him he's late with our allowance. How does he expect us to get through the college of our choice? So many people felt that hippies were hypocrites for criticizing the older generation while relying on their parents' money to support them. And here we have a look once again at the Equal Rights Amendment, another cartoon. It says, well, girls, at least the only way we can go is up. And here's a look at education and earnings, looking at the number of female college students, approximate, in 1970. So there were about 3 million in 1970. Compared to 2002, it's increased by about 11 times, up to 9,300,000 in 2002. Percentage of college students who were women was about 40.5% in 1970, but 56.4% in 2002. So we actually now, the majority of college students are now women. Percentage of undergraduate and graduate degrees received by women was 40.8% in 1970. It's gone up to 57.8% in 2002. The percentage of doctoral degrees received by women, it was 13.3% in 1970. In 2002, 45.5%. Women's earnings compared to every dollar earned by men, 59.4 cents in 1970. It's gone up to 76.6 cents in 2002. So still not equal, but definitely has made some gains. Looking at athletics, the number of female participants in high school athletics. In 1970, 294,000, which was, as a percentage, 7.4%, compared to 2002, where you now have 2,856,350 for 41.7%. Looking at corporate leadership and government service, the number of female chief executive officers of Fortune 500 companies. In 1970, there were none. In 2002, there were 6. The percentage of female federal civilian employees who were women, 30.3% in 1970, compared to 45% in 2002. The number of women elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, 10 in 1970. 2002, it was up to 59. The number of women elected to the U.S. Senate, once again, only 1 in 1970, but by 2002, that number is up to 13. Major Native American legislation. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. This act turned over 44 million acres of land to Alaska Natives and provided $962.5 million to settle other land claims by Alaska Natives. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. This act allowed tribes to implement their own education, health, and housing programs with government funding. And then finally, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. This act sets standards for adoptions in the Native American children, giving preference to relatives, members of the tribe, and Native American foster parents over white families. And here we have a visual summary of a time of social change. So we start out in the year 1961 with Native American activists issue the Declaration of Indian Purpose. In 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique is published. 1965, the Delano Grape Strike begins. 1967, Jose Angel Gutierrez and other students form Mayo. 1968, AIM is founded. 1969, the Woodstock Music and Arts Fair takes place in New York. 1970, La Raza Unida wins elections in several Texas cities. In 1972, Congress passes the ERA.